Avi, on to you. I just wanted to ask, perhaps you could give us a very broad outline of the landscape of where we are before we go into the slides.
Yep, certainly. So maybe I'll start with, our curiosity into this issue started a few years ago. Again, as a practitioner in Islamic finance, I'm not a full-time academic. I'm a visiting scholar doing academic research with the International Business Program at Drake University, where, again, we largely focus on the role of values in business. And our particular kind of area of research at the moment is around the intersection of faith, finance, and impact. So that kind of set the context for starting to look at Islamic finance more deeply, again, doing academic quality research into the space within the U.S. So our working assumption is that there is a role for Islamic finance within the onshore U.S. financial landscape. Now, again, this assumption may require some reassessment as a result of waking up early yesterday morning and seeing some results. But again, that continues to be, at least for now, our working assumption and the hypothesis that kind of informed our research. So the first step is assuming there is a role for Islamic finance in the onshore U.S. financial landscape. It's important to understand what is that role. And again, and answering that question is contingent upon having good data to help drive us to make the right strategic and tactical decision making. So when we started to look at how do you move the industry forward in the U.S., we recognized there is certainly a lack of research being done on the landscape to really inform productive strategies to move forward, which then led us to, partly we had Naripa as a visiting scholar at Drake about a year ago now, and again, given her interest in capital markets, my background in capital markets, we decided to start our research by focusing on Islamic capital markets, in particular, trying to understand, again, looking at onshore capital markets in the U.S. What are the current barriers and opportunities for Islamic finance? So within that, we kind of bucketed two sorts of barriers. The first of which are regulatory, and then the second have to do with capacity to execute and expand. So if we look a little bit at the regulatory barriers, one of the key issues which, again, it'll be very interesting to see over the next 12 to 18 months is the ability to engage with the regulators. Again, that's the Treasury, that's the SC or the SEC here in the U.S., both at the federal level, but then also at the state level. Again, so for insurance, for instance, tends to be regulated more at the state rather than at the federal level, right? So one of the key barriers that we need to better understand and address is what and how do we engage with the regulators. On the execution end, and again, we'll dive into these a little more as we continue our conversation. On the execution end, then, there are certain legal, financial, and marketing barriers, again, in terms of growing capital markets activity within the U.S. when it comes to Islamic finance.
Okay. Before going into specifics, I was just wondering, what is the overall level of acceptance? I'll give you just a bit of background. My chairman, Islan, who's sitting right there, he and I were in Tokyo just a week ago, and we sat down with a good 10 to 20 fund managers, Japanese fund managers, and both the fixed income as well as the equity market space. There is this very strong, what came across was a very strong eagerness, and they seem to be extremely keen to be looking at opportunities in Islamic finance. But let's say just looking at investing in sukuks, for example, there are legal, regulatory, or accounting issues that prevents Japanese investors to actually recognize sukuk as a debt and only looks at it, I think if I understood it correctly, as credit. But there is this strong willingness. What about the level of willingness here?
Yeah. So again, I think in the U.S. as well, right? There's the tax treatment of debt has, again, from a balance sheet perspective and a net income perspective, a lot of advantages, right? So again, that's where, from a barrier perspective, again, if you can have neutral or par treatment of sukuk from a tax perspective in the U.S., it creates a positive, or at least it makes it tax neutral compared to conventional debt issuance. Well, again, by and large, from an offshore perspective, I think U.S. institutional investors and U.S.-based issuers very happy to engage globally in the Islamic finance market. And again, they largely do so, though, through offshore vehicles. I think the crux of the question comes when you look at potential for onshore issuance by, again, U.S.-based issuers trying to issue under U.S. law domestic issuance. There, again, I think the demand to engage with regulators, to create change, to create a tax-neutral environment between, for instance, a sukuk and a conventional bond in the U.S. isn't there. And again, we are trying to go the next phase in our again, this was largely looking at secondary data, market indicators, et cetera. The next phase is to go out there in our research and collect primary data through utilizing survey instruments. And again, I'm not going to hypothesize on what we expect to find, but I think the level of demand or enthusiasm for, again, positive engagement with regulators by looking at onshore issuance of sukuk in the U.S. is unlikely to be there, especially as a function of what occurred yesterday with the presidential election.
So you believe that given the current the results, yesterday's results, it has a further impact?
Yeah, I think it certainly does. Again, it's one thing if it's treated purely from a economic perspective, right? And the ability to say, okay, and that's where, again, when it comes to sophisticated institutional investors and global financial firms and issuers, they recognize this is a financial instrument that in its ability to raise capital, or it's a way to generate and build out a more balanced portfolio from an asset management perspective. They get that. They participate globally. You see large U.S. and small U.S. institutions participate in global Islamic finance. But again, it's a very different optic for a U.S.-based institution when you look at the domestic landscape, because there are other factors to consider. Again, there's a brand equity risk. There's a receptiveness of the regulator, and whether or not the regulator, again, is going to be willing to. And again, the environment had been, I would argue, getting more facilitating, where there was an openness. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not the new administration will be more conservative, if they will be willing to engage. And again, if we look at the statements made during the campaign, I think the working assumption is there is unlikely to be a willingness to engage. But again, we don't know. And again, that's going to take 12 to 18 months to really, number one, people have got to be appointed. They've got to get in position. So again, for the next 12 to 18 months, I think it's a rich opportunity to collect additional data on the landscape to understand, again, are some of the viewpoints reflected in the campaign truly representative of the approach to financial services, or was it anomalous and it truly is more representative of a populist economic sentiment? I don't know, but that's where I think, again, in thinking about creating a long-term strategy for Islamic finance in the U.S., the primary level data needs to be collected. And again, I think the next 12 to 18 months is a rich collection period.
So what would be, going into specifics, the areas where, what should be done next within this period?
Yeah, so I think within this period, one of the key steps really is to kind of assess, from a legal barrier perspective, yeah, so maybe if we switch to it's slide 3. Oh, I can go up and if that's easier.
Okay.
Yeah. So, again, from a regulatory and legal barrier perspective is to understand, from the tax authorities, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, from those, from a lobby perspective, right? Do they have the right relationships? Are people willing to invest the time, the effort, the cost necessary to start to, and the intellectual capital necessary to start to think about constructively forming paths forward? Again, one of the ways that the UK was successful in moving the Islamic finance landscape domestically forward was, again, a positive orientation by the regulators to engage with it. Again, a very deliberate, sustained effort by market participants to work with them to craft regulations, a back and forth and very symbiotic sort of relationship to create, again, this positive system, positive ecosystem of change. And again, the next 12 to 18 months is really about measuring that ecosystem. And again, a lot of that is going out to collect primary data from the Muslim diaspora, from the state and federal level regulators. Again, that's not easily done. So, I mean, it's not a facile task to engage them in these conversations. But again, that's necessary because otherwise, from a strategic perspective, there's a lot of speculation and assumptions, which makes it very hard to mobilize both individuals and resources to create that positive environment.
I mean, 12 to 18 months is obviously not a very long time when you think about it. And we were talking about this earlier this morning about how the situation in the UK, which you brought up just now, it's different because the level of demand, for example, there's a very large Muslim community that lives there, number one. Number two, that community is fairly affluent or has built on affluence. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, from a capital markets perspective, it's a little different from perhaps a retail perspective or a kind of retail investor perspective. But like you said, the socioeconomic demographics of the Muslim diaspora is very important. You know, both from a financial perspective, but also from a, you know, kind of changing the landscape within the U.S. perspective, number one. Number two, the ability, again, of that diaspora to lobby and the issues which are relevant. And again, you know, as a practitioner, as someone coming from the finance field, again, Islamic finance is important to me, both from a values perspective, but also, you know, in terms of the broader global and domestic economic and financial landscape perspective. That, again, given, again, some of the rhetoric during the presidential campaign, you know, how relevant is Islamic finance given the other potential grievances and issues that the Muslim diaspora needs to address in the U.S. if some of that rhetoric is actually truly reflective of the policies that the new administration would plan to implement, right? Then, to be honest, Islamic finance is way down there. There are a lot of more fundamental human values-based issues that need to be addressed first.
I'm just thinking aloud now. In the case of I'm just going back again to the makeup and the demographics, as you said, of the Muslim communities in different countries. Say, in the case of the UK, obviously the banks themselves saw the opportunity. I mean, it's to do business, and it's to bring Islamic products to make it available to the Muslim community. Do you see the banks here or the financial institutions here? Because obviously they would have that strong lobby.
Yeah, and so I think that's where, again, there needs to be more data collection on the demographics. And so, again, from a 401k or an asset manager perspective, you know, you need to understand what is the savings capacity and then desire for Muslim investors in the U.S. to allocate assets, their investment assets, retirement assets, to Sharia-compliant products, number one. From a broader capital markets perspective, then, again, and that's where, again, primary level data collection is critical, is, you know, if I am, you know, let's just take a major financial institution here, again, participate globally in Islamic finance, but there is certainly a potential branding cost to me in being associated with driving a Sharia compliant or Islamic finance landscape within the U.S., right? So, again, the ability to essentially financially quantify what is the cost of driving that sort of agenda versus what is the benefit when it comes to, you know, essentially my long-term share value and growth is what essentially needs to occur. And again, that hasn't occurred. That's part of our next step is, again, to start to collect data around some of those elements so you can start to say, okay, what is the financial costs to driving this agenda? And what are the financial benefits to driving the agenda? And then it does. It comes down to an economic calculation as to whether or not financial institutions, again, who have responsibilities to their shareholders, are going to choose to engage. Again, I would say based on our landscape assessment, the costs are going to outweigh the benefits, certainly in the short to medium term, because of I think the general perception and the negative brand equity that would likely result from pursuing a Islamic capital markets agenda within the U.S.
So in terms of the research and its recommendations.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the recommendations, I mean, I think for long term, I think one of the key elements, and I'll start with the bottom left, is the issue of talent, right? From again, Wharton, Harvard, Drake, a lot of the academic institutions have, again, recognized that there is global demand for these sorts of products. Islamic capital markets products, Islamic finance products are financial products. They are values-based. But again, values-based products within the financial landscape are proliferating, impact investing, ESG, SRI, et cetera. So again, these are no different. And there's been they've been able to separate between the financial product and an emotional reaction to the term Sharia. So again, it's necessary to invest in building that talent ecosystem where you have sophisticated bankers, but where you also have sophisticated practitioners who understand Sharia. Not necessarily Sharia scholars, but who understand it and can execute within a complex regulatory framework like the U.S.
The application in the market.
Yes. Yep. And then number two, is infrastructure. And again, that's where to I think the point that Arifa raised, and again, the U.S. and both candidates raised this during the presidential campaign, significant need for upgrading of U.S. infrastructure. Again, asset-based has potentially attractive opportunities for Sharia-compliant investors. At the state level, again, states have a little more control of potential issuance. Certain states have indicated in the past, such as New York. Again, I think even last year at this conference, State Senator Parker said, from an Islamic finance perspective, New York is open for business, right? But again, they've had a potential law that's been in committee, I think, since 2011. So again, infrastructure assets present an opportunity to start to operationalize on this. But again, there needs to be a deeper interaction with the states. And again, the recent election and seeing how states have come out on it, it may require some repositioning of that interaction, but that's certainly an opportunity for some practice. The third, then, is certainly the political willpower to engage. And again, there, it'll be very interesting next 12 to 18 months to see how much of the rhetoric is actually reflective of the desired policies that will be implemented, or was rhetoric for largely political purpose.
There was our Professor Eccles talked about the similarities, or for lack of better terms, the commonalities between SRI type investments and Islamic capital markets. What are your views?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And it's the same thing. If we look at, for instance, the FMCG space, right? One of the more successful halal products is Saffron Road. And again, it's a ready-to-eat kind of, put in the microwave kind of meal, ready-to-eat meal, is halal. Yet their positioning in the marketplace has been around, sustainability, organic, et cetera. You can purchase it at Whole Foods or any of your kind of high-end organic grocers, et cetera. It's still a halal product, but because of that alignment with more agnostic or broader U.S. consumer values and what's driving U.S. consumers in making their purchase decisions, and the marketing and positioning of the product around those has allowed it to be very successful. Again, it's a halal product, but it's very successful with non-halal consumers because of those other attributes. So again, when it comes to products, they can certainly be Sharia compliant. But again, from a market receptivity perspective, it's understanding what are the drivers of consumer demand, and how do you successfully position that product And if it and again, within the Sharia space, yes, it's required to be Sharia compliant, but if that's not necessarily relevant from a broad consumer perspective, if you know it's compliant, it's certified as compliant, that's great, but that's not the way to sell your product if that's not what the consumer is demanding. The consumer is demanding a product that has XYZ SRI attributes. The fact that it's Sharia compliant, you can deliver on what is driving their purchase decision, i.e., extra return, economic and environmental sustainability, addressing poverty, addressing health, etc. Then again, in many ways, the Sharia compliance to that consumer is relevant, but to us, from if it's important to you from a values base, it's required, but it's not how you sell it. And so that's where, again, there needs to be some adaptability to the drivers of consumer demand. And again, that's where I think the next 12 to 18 months, in particular with both the Muslim diaspora and the broader financial community in the U.S., provides a pretty rich opportunity to collect very frank, what I reflect truthful information on, is something that's Sharia compliant, even if it happens to be SRI and everything else. Is the Sharia compliance issue a non-starter, or is it truly irrelevant to the purchase decision, and where is it net relevant?
So, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. We're very happy to take questions.